Alright everyone, what we talked about in our last lecture was just a brief introduction to free body diagrams and 2D equilibrium. Before we move further to do some more calculation-based examples, we need to first explain a little bit more about the supports that free body diagrams will have so we know how to model real-world systems into the free body diagrams that we'll be using to solve our statics problems. So, let's get started. Structures all around the world appear static, but in reality, they're subject to lots of variable dynamic loading conditions, whether that be wind, snow, cars, and even earthquakes. All structures around the world need to take into account all sorts of different environmental conditions in order to stand tall and remain strong. As a result, every single structure has to be able to stand up, and it's very important to understand how we support those structures. Now, as you can see below, no structure is held up like the one shown below. At least let's hope not, especially for that guy's sake. But it is really important to understand how we support our structures. When you look more closely at all the different bridges and walkways and things around you, you'll begin to notice how that they connect with the earth is actually mightily important in how they handle loads. And in ENES 102, every single problem we do, the structure is going to be supported by the environment in some way. And the environmental forces are going to be the reaction forces that we draw on the free body diagram, similar to the examples we were doing before when we had the ladder leaning up against the wall pushed back on the ladder. Well, there's more than just one way to support a structure, and I'm going to illustrate those concepts right now. So, the first and most basic type of support system you can have for your structural system is what's called a simple support. And it can't really get any more simple than that. The joke is already in its name. Imagine that you just took a little egg and you put it on a little table. That's it. That's a simple support. It's just a beam on top of another structure, and it's similar to the ladder that we talked about before. The reaction force that you'll draw on the free body diagram in response to a simple support is that a simple support can only do one thing. It can provide only a normal force. That's exactly what we were showing before in our free body diagrams when one box was leaning on another, when we had the ladder leaning against the wall, when we had the box on the ramp. And just when one object is resting on top of the other, the object that's being rested upon applies a force normal to its surface. So the only other force that it could technically apply is the friction force, and you saw that in the examples that we did before. But that's the first kind of support, the simple support. The second type of support that we have in statics is the rocker and roller support. Bad air guitar. But rocker and roller supports essentially look like this. They don't look like a guitar, although that would be pretty cool. But effectively what a rocker and roller support does is it allows the system to roll. It's like you put wheels on something. So imagine your car, it's resting on top of wheels. Now your car can move left and right. You can even lift your car off of the ground. But if you try and push down on your car's not going to go anywhere because those wheels hold strong. Think of a rocking chair. The same is true. You can push a rocking chair left and right. You can lift a rocking chair off of the ground. But if you sit down in a rocking chair, you don't fall down towards the ground. The rocking chair holds you and supports you. So in statics, what a rocker and roller can do is actually very similar to a simple support, is that it can only ever push up. Your rocking chair can't pull back down to earth to prevent itself from being lifted up. So rockers and rollers can only provide an upward force in your free body diagram. They actually cannot provide a frictional force or a force in the X because wheels allow an object to roll. So you don't have to worry about an X reaction force with these. It's only a force normal to the roller itself. If you actually look at this in the real world, they do exist. And it's actually kind of shocking to see that rockers and rollers exist on a grand scale. Actually, lots of bridges and other structures have rockers and rollers hooking them to the ground. And you might go, oh my god, the bridge is just a giant car? It might sound really scary at first, but I assure you it's totally safe because the structure is so large. And if you look really closely at this picture, it does allow a little bit of back and forth, but there are these kind of ridges that prevent the bridge from just totally rolling away. Now, there's another really cool technology that's essentially a three-dimensional version of a rocker roller. And what that's called is an isolation bearing. Now, What's really good about these types of supports is that they can isolate your structure from the ground in which they're attached to. And where would you want that to happen? Imagine for a second that you're sitting in your house in the middle of the night watching TV when all of a sudden the ground starts shaking and you run outside into the middle of the street because you're afraid that there's an earthquake, and you find that you're the only person that did that. This is a true story. It's when I lived in San Francisco this happened. But in an earthquake, the more rigid your building is, the more it is attached to the ground, the more susceptible it is to damage. But if you can isolate that building from the ground using rockers, rollers, or isolation bearings, you actually make that building safer. Let me show you a demo of this. Pretty much isolating the building from the ground, this uses Newton's first law, which is the law of inertia. If the building is above the ground, when the ground moves, the building has no force to be able to move it with the shaking. So the building actually stays perfectly stable in the middle while the ground below shakes. And you can imagine that if you were an occupant of that building, you'd feel a lot more comfortable and safe in this particular example. And to illustrate this point even further, look at this next slide. In our example here, what you can see is 2 jars of green goo, or whatever it might be. The building on the right has isolation bearings, which they just showed you at the bottom, and the goo just remains perfectly steady. Whereas the goo on the left jar, because it doesn't have these isolation bearings, gets shaken all over. And that's where it's dangerous, especially in an earthquake. Lots of damage occurs inside when shelves and things fall on top of people. So isolation bearings and rockers and rollers, they're real. They exist in the real world, and they have a purpose to keep people safe and to keep your building upright. The other main kind of support we have in statics is a pin support. And you've seen pin supports all the time. You probably played on one as a kid. A pin is essentially a type of support that allows a rotation but prevents all other types of motion. So in a free body diagram equivalent, the pin prevents the object from being pulled up, prevents it from being pulled down, and it can prevent it from being pushed left or pushed right. So a pin will do whatever it needs to do, but the one thing it cannot prevent is it cannot prevent rotation. Now what I'll show you is a cool little demonstration with a homemade handy-dandy pin support demo. So the way that this works is a pin allows rotation. I can push this arm right here and it can rotate about the pin. But when I push down on this system, the piece of wood doesn't move. And if I were to push up at this joint, this also wouldn't move either. If I try and pull left, I can't pull this away from the pin, and if I push to my right, I also cannot move the pin either. So a pin can provide a reaction support in all the different directions. So if I push on this beam this way here, the pin is going to push back in the opposite direction to prevent the beam from moving. The last support that we really need to talk about when it comes to rigid body equilibrium is a fixed support. And what a fixed support does is, you guessed it, it fixes the thing in question to another thing, usually via a weld or what's called a gusset plate, which you can see with the roof trusses shown below in that picture. So a fixed support essentially can do it all. It prevents motion up and down, it prevents motion left and right, and it prevents rotations. If you wanted to model what a pin support was like, you could take a good old pair of scissors, which is probably not the safest thing to do. You can put it in your hand right here, and if you push down on the scissors, they don't move. If you push up, they don't move. If you pull left, if you push right, they don't move. And if you try and rotate them, it also cannot move. Your hand is really rigid on the scissors and prevents all of those types of motion. So again, the way that supports work is when I push here on the scissors, the support pushes back in the opposite and equal direction to fight that. That's Newton's third law, and that's what supports are all about. There is another type of support to mention, which is what's called a rod support. And sometimes you'll see these on homeworks or group works, or possibly even the exam. Essentially what this does is, because there's a pin at the top and a pin at the bottom of this system, it's what's called a two-force member. Now, I'm going to explain this in the frames and machines unit way in the future, but the idea is, if this system exists, the only type of support that it can provide is actually along its own direction. So the support, when you draw a pin-pinned rod support on a free body diagram, the direction of the reaction force is always in the same direction of that rod itself. Now there's mathematical reasons why this is the case, and as I'm saying, we'll get into this later in the course. But for right now, when you're doing free body diagrams, or if you see this, now you know how to treat it in your system. Last but not least, I feel like I keep saying that, but now we really do have the last support that I'm going to talk about, and this is called cables. No, not Xfinity, not Verizon Fios, but cable supports. So essentially, we know that all sorts of things are hung by cables, whether that might be lamps hung from the ceiling, a chandelier, whether that's a bridge out in the real world, or all sorts of other big structures. As you walk around Maryland's campus, you might even see them in Kim Engineering Building, as you can see suspension bridge in there. But the way that a cable support works is we know that a cable can only pull. You cannot push through a cable. If I tied a rope to something and I tried to push that thing, that would not work out very well, I can assure you. But if you tie a rope to something, you can pull it. That actually does work. So, the way that cable supports work in a free body diagram is you isolate the point that the cable is tied to. In this particular case, point C or point E. And the force that the cable is applying at that point is always away from that point. It's a tension. So at point C, the force or the tension of cable CE is pulling upwards and to the right. However, at point E, the cable is actually pulling down and to the left. What you can see here is Newton's third law of work, equal and opposite. Because the rope can only ever pull at either of its ends, the arrows are going to be pointing inward at that particular spot. We'll do some examples where we work more with cables moving forward, but this is a good introduction. And again, when you look at the other 2 points, E and G, as well as D and C, you see the same exact methodology at work, which is that cables can only pull, they cannot push. Let's talk a little bit about how this all applies to systems in the real world and showcase 2 of the world's most marvelous and impressive structures. Now, as I told you before, I went to California for grad school, and I can't tell you how many times I went to the Golden Gate Bridge. Well, I probably could, but it's definitely more than 20 or 30 times. It's a beautiful, majestic structure. They really got it right, and they did a really cool job. But the Golden Gate Bridge, as we know, is a suspension bridge. And the way that a suspension bridge works is that it's got the cables attached to it that help redirect force in a more efficient and useful way. Now, what's really cool about a suspension bridge, as you can see as I highlight the slides here, is that the suspension rope actually ties into the ground. And it might be a little bit hard to see it with the yellow, but the Golden Gate Bridge cable actually goes into the earth and keeps the structure stable. What's really cool is when you look at the new bridge that was built out in the Bay Area, which is the Oakland Bay Bridge. This was built in response to the great earthquake of 1989 that destroyed the other bridge, and it only took them 30 years to build this one. What's pretty cool about this bridge is that it's the first bridge of its type in the world. To the untrained eye, it may look like a suspension bridge, but if you actually look closer, it's what's called a self-anchored suspension bridge. Now, what's the main difference here? The main difference is that the rope that goes through the top of the bridge doesn't go down and connect to the earth. It actually slides underneath of the bridge and connects back up to the other side and goes down, connects underneath, and then goes back up to the other side as well. What's really great about this, and goes back to the earlier slides I showed you, is that if you can isolate this structure from the earth, then it has a much greater freedom of movement when the earth shakes below it. As a result, the Oakland Bay Bridge is extremely resilient against earthquakes. And let me show you a brief little snippet of video that shows you how the structure behaves in the event of an earthquake to keep it safe. So what you can see in this video is that the Oakland Bay Bridge has a great deal of flexibility and movement. And although that looks really scary to the untrained eye, the truth is that this bridge's ability to isolate itself from the ground in a violent earthquake actually makes it extremely resilient and very, very strong. And one other thing that's really cool about this is if you look at the tower of the bridge as well, you'll notice that it's split up into 4 columns. This actually allows the columns to flex even more, And in the event that a column gets damaged, you don't have to replace the whole bridge. You can replace just one piece, and the overall structure itself will remain intact. Although the Oakland Bay Bridge is really awesome, the Golden Gate Bridge is not to be outdone. It has some cool fun facts about it as well. When you look inside the cable of the Golden Gate Bridge and all suspension bridges, it's not one giant cable. If you had that big of a piece of steel, it would have absolutely no ability to flex or move. Inside of the cable of suspension bridges is actually lots and lots of smaller cables. And a fun fact about these cables in the Golden Gate Bridge, guess where they were made? New Jersey. I made them. Not quite. But it's really cool. And inside, because this wire is so small and it's strung back and forth over and over again, there are 80,000 miles of cable inside the Golden Gate Bridge, which is enough to circle the Earth 3 times. Now, if that's not cool to you, I don't know what is. That's the end of our lecture today. Hopefully you've got a good feel for what types of supports there are and how to model them in free body diagrams.
Why won't the rope push the plow?